The night Caelum signed the divorce papers. He sat alone in the parking lot of the courthouse for 2 hours, engine off, hands on the steering wheel, staring at nothing. The sky outside was the color of bruised ash, and the wind moved through the empty streets like something grieving. He had told himself he would feel relief. That was what everyone promised, that once the papers were signed, the weight would lift, the chest would finally open up, and he would breathe again like a man who had been underwater for years. But sitting there in that cold car, in that hollow silence, Caelum felt nothing except the particular kind of emptiness that only comes when you lose something you spent years trying to save. He and Nadia had been married for 6 years. 6 years of Sunday mornings and inside jokes, of building a home from bare walls and borrowed furniture, of learning each other's fears in the dark. But somewhere between the 3rd year and the 5th, something cracked. Not in a dramatic, explosive way. There was no single night, no single wound. It was more like a slow erosion, the kind that happens to coastlines over decades, until one day you look up and realize the ground you were standing on is simply gone. Nadia had grown distant in ways Caelum couldn't name. He had grown quiet in ways she couldn't reach, and by the time they finally spoke honestly to each other, the words came out like a eulogy for...
You're now watching AF Stories, where one simple act of kindness can rewrite someone's entire story. If you believe in compassion, second chances, and unexpected miracles, hit the like button, share this video, leave your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe so you never miss a story like this.
Something already buried. She had been the one to ask for the divorce, and he had been the one to agree, because by then, agreeing felt like the only loving thing left he could do. He didn't fight it. He didn't beg. He just signed his name on the dotted line and watched 6 years fold themselves into a manila envelope. And that was supposed to be the end, except it wasn't. 3 weeks after the divorce was finalized, Caelum received a phone call he never expected. The number was unfamiliar at first, but the voice on the other end stopped him mid-step in his apartment hallway. It was Soraya, Nadia's mother. The woman who had watched him walk her daughter down an aisle, who had pressed his face between her hands at their wedding reception and called him her son without hesitation. The woman he had assumed, along with everything else, he had lost forever. Her voice was calm but carried something underneath it, something with weight. She didn't call to argue or to assign blame or to speak poorly of him the way he might have expected after a divorce. She called to ask if he would meet her for tea. Just tea. Just a conversation. She said it simply, the way people say things when they mean them completely. Caelum, I know what happened between you and Nadia, and I think it's time you heard some things. Not from her. From me. He almost said no. Every rational thought he had told him to leave it alone, to let the past stay buried, to not reopen a door he had already locked from the inside. But there was something in Soraya's voice, a kind of maternal gravity, that made him feel, for the first time in months, that someone was actually seeing him. Not the version of him that had failed, not the version of him that had been too quiet, too passive, too slow to understand what was slipping away. Just him. He met her at a small cafe near the edge of their old neighborhood, the kind of place with mismatched chairs and windows fogged from the inside. Soraya was already seated when he arrived, her hands wrapped around a ceramic cup, her silver hair pinned back the way she always wore it. She looked older than he remembered, but her eyes were the same dark and deep and impossibly kind. She stood when she saw him, and held his hands in both of hers without saying anything for a moment, and Caelum felt something in his chest crack open in a way he hadn't let it since the day the papers were signed. They sat across from each other, and Soraya began to speak. She told him things he hadn't known. She told him that Nadia had been carrying a grief long before their marriage, a grief she had never properly named or treated, rooted in a loss she experienced as a young woman, a loss that had taught her to leave before she could be left. She told him that Nadia had pushed him away, not because she stopped loving him, but because some part of her had been terrified of how much she did. That her distance was not indifference, it was armor. And that the tragedy was not that they had stopped fighting for each other, but that neither of them had known what they were actually fighting against. Caelum sat very still through all of this. He didn't interrupt. He didn't deflect. He just listened, the way he wished he had listened years ago, and with every word Soraya spoke, he felt the narrative he had been carrying, the one where he was simply not enough, begin to shift and crack and fall apart. It wasn't a comfortable feeling. It was the kind of painful recalibration that comes when you realize the story you told yourself about your own life was never the whole story. But then, Soraya paused. She set her cup down gently and looked at him in a way that reminded him of something a lighthouse does in a storm: steady, intentional, not asking you to turn around but making sure you can find the shore. And she said it quietly, with the full weight of a woman who had watched two people she loved destroy something beautiful because they didn't have the tools to save it. She said, "I spent years watching from the outside. I watched you both and I said nothing, because I thought it wasn't my place. I told myself their marriage is their business, their pain is their lesson." She paused again. "I was wrong." And now her voice softened but did not waver. "Now it's my turn." She meant it as a beginning, not an ending. What followed over the next several months was something Caelum had no category for. Soraya began to show up in his life with quiet consistency, not intrusively, not with any agenda he could identify, but simply as a presence. She would call to check in. She would leave a container of food outside his apartment door with a note that said nothing more than "Eat something real today." She would send him voice messages when she read something she thought he needed to hear. She was not trying to fix him or redirect him back toward Nadia or rewrite any ending. She was simply refusing to abandon him the way the rest of the world had assumed was appropriate after the marriage ended. And slowly, with the kind of slowness that cannot be rushed, Caelum began to heal. Not from Nadia, or not only from Nadia, but from something older and deeper. From the belief he had carried since long before the marriage that he was someone people eventually left. That love was temporary and conditional, and would always, at some point, expire. Soraya was dismantling that belief not with grand gestures or therapeutic language, but with the simple, radical act of staying, of showing up, of saying through her consistent, unremarkable presence, "You are worth knowing. Even now, even after, even still." One afternoon, sitting in her kitchen while she moved around the stove and the smell of cardamom filled the room, Caelum asked her why. Why she had called him that day. Why she had kept showing up when she owed him nothing, when the divorce had technically released her from any obligation to him. Soraya turned from the stove and looked at him for a long moment before answering. She said that grief was not something you got to own by yourself. That when you loved someone, truly loved them, that love didn't expire with a signature or a legal document or the turning of a calendar page. She said she had loved him as a son, and that was not something a mother simply switched off because the paperwork changed. He cried then. Not dramatically, not in a way that required acknowledgement. Just quietly, the way people cry when something they stopped believing and turns out to still be true. The story of Caelum and Nadia did not have a fairy tale ending. They did not reconcile. They did not find their way back to each other, and perhaps that was right. Perhaps some doors are meant to close so that the people walking through them can grow into who they need to become. But the story of Caelum and Soraya, that was something else entirely. That was the story of an unexpected grace, of a woman who had every reason to walk away, choosing instead to walk toward. Of love in its least celebrated and most profound form, the love that asks nothing, claims nothing, and gives anyway. There are people in this world who will surprise you. Not the ones you expected to stay, not always the ones you built your life around. Sometimes it is the one standing just at the edge of your story, watching and waiting and carrying more love than you knew to ask for. And sometimes, when everything you thought was permanent has fallen away, it is that person, the unexpected one, who steps forward and says, "Now, it is my turn," and means it with their whole, unborrowed heart. If this story reached something inside you, if it reminded you of someone who showed up when they didn't have to, or if it touched a part of you that is still healing from something you thought was over, please give this video a like, share it with someone who needs to feel less alone today, and subscribe so you never miss a story like this one. Your small gesture means more than you know.